You're listening to The Dead Prussian, a podcast about war and warfare.
When I was younger, I saw a pretty cool movie called T2 Judgment Day. And that was pretty much all I knew for a long time about robots and war. One of the vehicles I saw in that movie was a robot plane. You could probably describe it as like a drone. It was a quadcopter, not too different from what you see photographers getting around nearly every park with these days. Drones have become a reality since that movie was released. Unmanned aerial vehicles, surveillance, Predators, Reapers, Hermes 450s, and Scan Eagles. Some are designed to watch, others are designed to watch and target. But it's interesting how these types of technology advances can affect the way we go to war, the way soldiers fight. G'day listeners, it's your host with the most, Mick here, and I am quite happy with all the support we've been getting, except you haven't given me any iTunes reviews lately, so that's a bit rude. But the support in the other area has been pretty good. So if you are one of those people who hasn't thrown any stars our way on iTunes, please jump on and do it. As I intimated before, we're going to talk about UAVs or drones. And I need a guest to do that. So today, my guest is Ulrike Franke. Now that's my Australian attempt at a German pronunciation, so we'll just leave it at that. Now, Ulrike is a Doctor of Philosophy student in International Relations. She's supervised by Professor Sir Hugh Strawn and Professor Lucas Kello. In her work, she focuses on the military implications of the increasing use of unmanned aerial vehicles, which is UAVs or drones, by Western armed forces. She's interested in the impact of military technology on warfare and the so-called revolution in military affairs. Ulrike was part of a UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Counter-Terrorism Ben Emerson's research team, working on drone use in counter-terrorism contexts. She is a researcher at the European Council on Foreign Relations in London, and she holds a Bachelor of Arts from Sciences Po Paris and a double Master of Arts degree from Sciences Po Paris and the University of St. Gallen. Or St. Gallen. I don't really know how to pronounce that, but that's okay because I never get the pronunciation of these things right. However, it's a pretty impressive bio, but most importantly, Ulrike and I are going to talk about the impact of drones on strategic culture and the doctrine of some Western armies. Ulrike, thanks for coming on the show.
Well, thanks a lot for having me. It's a pleasure to be on the show, and I've been a regular listener for quite a while, so I'm very honored to talk to you. And I'm also sure that all of my dead Prussian ancestors would be very happy that I'm on your show. So thanks a lot.
Well, not to sound too crass, but I'm pretty happy you've got a lot of dead Prussian ancestors. Not so much that they're dead, but that they're Prussian. Now, Ulrike, you spend a lot of time reading and writing about drones and their impact on military doctrine. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about what got you into this field?
Yeah, sure. So basically, I came to drones through the Revolution in Military Affairs, or through the RMA. I wrote my master's thesis already, so that was years ago, on the so-called Revolution in Military Affairs. And that is what most people know as the Revolution in Military Affairs, namely toward the end of the Cold War, lots of new technologies were being developed, so precision-guided munitions, GPS, the so-called network-centric warfare, and all of that. And that was considered revolutionary. And I looked into this, and I thought that was quite interesting. But the more I looked at it, the more I got interested in one specific technology that only played a tiny role in that RMA of the end of the Cold War, but was kind of rising at the moment that I was working, and that's drones or unmanned aerial vehicles. And at the time I was writing, there were more and more claims about drones being revolutionary. So the media and some researchers basically argued, yeah, this is the new cool thing. They're going to revolutionize warfare. It's all going to be very different. And to me, I mean, at first they kind of sounded convincing and reasonable, because I mean these are kind of cool technologies, and you think, yeah, that certainly must change the way we fight wars. But in a way, the more I looked into it, the more I realized that all these claims about drones being revolutionary really had very little foundation. So I'm not saying that they were wrong, it's just that a lot of people just kind of said drones were revolutionary without actually being able to make the argument, because they hadn't really looked into how drones were actually used on the battlefield. And I think a lot of people were, in fact, influenced by science fiction, as you mentioned in your introduction, because a lot of people thought, oh my God, I've seen this in so many movies. Now everything's going to change and we're going to have sci-fi warfare.
Yeah, Skynet.
But again, so I felt that there wasn't enough. Yeah, exactly, Skynet, yeah. But I felt that there wasn't enough research being done, mainly also because the focus was and really is still so much on the United States use of drones. And specifically the United States use of armed drones outside of official battle spaces. So that's kind of the one thing everyone looks at. And of course, there's a good reason to look into this. But I do feel that the changes drones have caused in military operations or unmilitary operations, doctrine, strategy, military organization, all of that really has been understudied in any other context. So that's why I felt that someone needed to look into this, and that's exactly what I'm doing in my research.
Well, I'm really glad you decided to get into this topic, because one, it meant I was able to book you as a guest, and two, we're able to talk about this very interesting topic. And sometimes it's hard to find interesting guests on interesting topics. There's a lot of boring people that stick up their hands to talk to me. I don't know why. Now, your research, as you said, is a little bit different than what other people are focusing on when it comes to drone warfare. Can you tell us a little bit about your study on the use of unmanned aerial vehicles on military operations?
Sure, absolutely. And I hope to live up to your definition of me as interesting. So, right. So in my research, I looked at 3 different countries' use of military drones. So I looked at how Germany, the United Kingdom, and the United States are using military drones in operations. And I basically chose these 3 countries because that gives me the full range of systems out there. So if you have these 3 countries, they basically use everything from very small, unarmed surveillance drones to larger surveillance systems, such as the Global Hawk, which is the biggest drone out there at all, and it's an I-STAR, so surveillance and intelligence systems, and to armed drones, so drones that carry bombs and missiles. And I study how these systems are used and what differences there are between different countries, between different armed forces. And by looking at these 3 countries, I also get different contexts. So I look at how drones are being used in official battle zones. So that's the case for Germany and the UK that use drones in Afghanistan. But as I mentioned at the beginning, I also look at how the United States is using drones outside of official battle spaces. So in Pakistan and partly also in Yemen and Somalia, because that really gets a lot of interest and coverage. Maybe just as a side note, I certainly would have loved to study a few other countries as well. And most importantly, Israel is a super important case when it comes to drones. So Israel is a leading nation, really, in drone development and also a leading drone exporter. And just, again, as a side note, I mean, you could argue that it really was the Israelis that put drones on the map because they used them in the 1982 Lebanon War. And while there had been drones before, it was always a kind of 1 step forward, 2 step back development. So drones were used in Vietnam, but then they were kind of forgotten and they were developed, and then they didn't really live up to their expectations. They were forgotten again. And in 1982, the Israelis used drones in the Lebanon War with quite some success. And that was picked up by the Americans. And that really kind of kickstarted the drone development. So again, it would be really fun to look at Israel and partly also China and Russia. But the thing is that there is very little information available on these countries. And I also don't speak Hebrew, which kind of hinders the research. So if any of the listeners out there want to go and discuss drones and study drone use in Israel, that would be certainly interesting.
Surely we've got
But anyway,
some Hebrew speakers. I imagine we've got a few.
Well, you never know.
Yeah.
Right, but my study of drones really is based on this idea that it's not the technology that matters most, but it's how you use it. And the classic example of that, of course, is the tank. So the tank has been on the battlefield since 1916, but it was the Blitzkrieg doctrine developed by the Wehrmacht that really made tank warfare decisive and revolutionary. And I'm trying to find out whether countries have developed these kind of revolutionary drone doctrines on how to best use drones and whether that makes them revolutionary.
Okay.
So maybe to just talk about a few of the findings that could be interesting for our listeners. So in Afghanistan, what I thought was very interesting is that drones really changed the battle space awareness of commanders and soldiers, and really down to the lowest level. And that was one of the biggest impact in my experience. Drones provided increased cover. So as an example, German forces, after they got the Heron drone, which is an Israeli drone system that the Germans bought, German forces were actually no longer allowed, or at least supposed to, leave camp without a drone overhead. So
Really?
drones really provided this armed overwatch, that we didn't have before. Drones didn't really lift the fog of war, but they certainly helped a lot. And what I thought interesting was drones help with things that sound kind of marginal, but are actually really decisive in warfare. So the classic example for me is traffic control. So drones were used to tell the troops on the ground where the next traffic jam was, or kind of whether to turn left or right. And I spoke with a German commander, and he said, well, we went into Kabul and we didn't have any street maps, or the street maps we had were super old and we didn't know whether the streets were still there, whether new houses had been built, etc., etc. So we basically used drones overhead to tell us turn right, turn left, there's a traffic jam ahead, don't go there. And that may seem, somewhat unimportant, but it actually is super important in a military operation where you fight against insurgents, where you have IEDs, all of these things. So you don't want to be a sitting duck because your convoy is stuck in a traffic jam. So that was actually quite important.
Yeah, it's something people probably don't think of when they think of war zones and drone use.
Yeah, no, exactly. But this was really decisive. So these are some of the kind of in bello findings, so the things that drones are influencing during war.
Yeah.
But of course, one of the kind of big debates around drones is ad bellum, so before war. And the question is whether drones are making war more likely, whether more wars are being waged because drones are there. And I found this to be a very difficult discussion, mainly because this certainly isn't the first time that this has been claimed. So a few people may remember when Bill Clinton increasingly used missiles.
Yep.
There was a whole debate on whether missiles are making wars more likely and whether we're seeing more wars just because we have missiles.
Yeah, okay.
And my general view from my research is that I don't think that drones cause war. And I spoke to a parliamentarian, a German parliamentarian, and he said something that I thought was quite interesting. He basically said, how little confidence must people have in the parliamentarian process that they think that just because we have a new technology, we're now going to run around and wage more wars. And he thought that was absurd. Nevertheless, drones can be somewhat seductive. And so my view is basically that the problem with drones is that they sound like an easy, no strings attached solution. They kind of sound short term. If you need to do something, you would rather send drones than send in people, because you feel the moment you have boots on the ground, they're going to be there forever. And with drones, you kind of go in, go out, and that's it. The problem is that's just not true. This is really what the US experience in particular has shown us over the last, 15 years now. The US used drones in that way for the first time in Yemen in 2002. And since then, over the last 15 years, these operations have widened to, at least two other countries, Pakistan and Somalia, and probably a few more. Yeah. And thousands of people have been killed. So it really isn't this easy in, easy out solution that a lot of people think it is. And I think this is something important to keep in mind when when people say, well, let's just send in drones or let's just send in airplanes and do airstrikes.
It's very interesting, the discussion around the impact of a new weapon technology on let's use a word, I don't know if it exists, bellicosity of a nation. How much they want to go to war. I'm currently wading my way through a essay on the First World War at the moment, and the arms race, is quite a significant fact of one of the causes of that war. Well, I hope it is. We'll see when I get my essay back. But it's interesting how technology can affect a strategic and military culture. I'm interested to know what effect the technology's had on the strategy and doctrine of the military's alliance use. You've talked a little bit about the German experience. What else can you tell us about how this has affected, I suppose, the strategic and military cultures of those people who use this technology?
The first thing with drones is that for drones, doctrine and strategy has really, or have followed the technology. Okay. So sometimes it's the other way around, right? Sometimes a strategy saying we would need a system to do X, and then you kind of try to develop the system.
Yeah.
With drones, it absolutely has been the other way around, mainly because countries have procured drones as urgent operational requirements.
Yeah.
They basically ended up with these systems on the battlefield and needed to find out how to best use them. And there has been an enormous learning curve. And that really was very interesting. So I talked to a British intelligence officer who had the most interesting job, namely he toured Afghanistan and he went to all these different outposts, command posts, and explained the people there who already had drone systems and who were already using them, how to best use them and what kind of intelligence products they could get out of these systems.
Okay.
So, of course, the people, these are army drones, the people there already knew how to fly them, they were trained in that, but they didn't really understand all the things you could do with drones. And this officer basically went around and told them that, and I thought that was very interesting. So my finding at this point is that doctrine really hasn't changed enormously. So I mentioned things like, troops not going out without drones. So that would be one, and also smaller scouting teams, or generally less need for scouting teams. So that has changed operations and doctrine somewhat. But I really think that we are still in this learning curve. And that's why I would say that if drones are revolutionary, I think we haven't really seen that yet, because this decisive doctrine, the kind of blitzkrieg doctrine for drones, hasn't really been developed yet.
Okay.
So we're still looking for the best way to use drones. My money is certainly on swarms. I think swarming will play a very important role. Autonomy will too. Manned, unmanned teaming is another one. But, there's a lot of doctrinal and strategic writing and thinking out there, depending on the country. In a few countries, it's more writing and less thinking, or the other way around.
Yeah.
But yeah, we're really still trying to figure that out.
It's very cool that you use the term swarms, because all my sci-fi geeks, I've got a few of them who listen to the show, they'll be super excited about swarms of drones. Also,
well, there's so much that. Yeah, there's so much interesting. There are so many interesting links between science fiction and drones. I mean, I kind of dismissed it at the beginning because I felt that sci-fi has also had negative implications on how drones are being seen.
Yeah.
But honestly, I mean, I'm a big sci-fi fan, and I even wrote a short article kind of going through my favorite science fiction books and looking at how drones are portrayed in them and what this tells us about the future of drones. I think that can certainly help and inform our thinking. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the swarms are cool. Manned and unmanned teaming. We actually have a guest coming up in the next a few months who's going to talk to us about manned and unmanned teaming. So we won't go into that at the moment, because I want the listeners to research it themselves and see if they can guess who my guest is. They won't guess. I'm very sneaky. So this all sounds very cool for the individual soldier on the ground. How does having access to this technology, and I still think of it as futuristic, how does this have an effect on how they do their day job, I suppose?
Yeah, I think that's exactly the right question. Honestly, I mean, this is one of the areas where I would argue that drones may have been somewhat revolutionary. the impact of drones on individual soldiers' experience of warfare. And there are two types of impacts. So I'll start with the kind of better known story. And this is something that has been picked up by the media somewhat. This is the kind of drone pilot who sits in Nevada, like next to Las Vegas, and operates drones from there. And that is a new type of situation, really. I mean, of course, not every soldier in warfare is in the battle zone already today. I mean, lots of people are, I don't know, on submarines or somewhere else. But this situation where you have someone who's directly in the battle, is kind of directly engaged in the battle zone, but not there and nowhere near, really thousands and thousands of kilometers away. This is something that is very, very new and quite different. And actually, just last week, I interviewed a British Reaper pilot. And he was stationed in Creech, so in Creech Air Force Base, which is in Nevada and Las Vegas. So before British Reapers were flown from the UK, they were flown from the US, and there still are partly. And so he was based there. He was one of the first Reaper pilots based there. And he told me in our conversation, he mentioned this over and over again, how weird and also how difficult it is to be working a kind of 8-hour shift, basically being in Afghanistan, being in a war zone, coming back, clocking out, going home and play with your kids and repair the washing machine. And he said that sometimes this was extremely difficult, and he and many of his colleagues really struggled with this. And there are researchers out there that basically say, this is so bad that we should actually deploy these troops. So not necessarily like to Afghanistan or in the war zone, but deploy them somewhere that they are sent away, do their job, and then come home. Because this weird situation where you're in a war but not really is really quite difficult. And there's another aspect for these pilots, which is the problem is not only being in a war while sleeping at home, but also being able to see war up close and much closer than most soldiers really do. And that was particularly a big difference for drone pilots, as in most drone pilots Air Force pilots were formerly piloting manned aircraft. So they were pilots and flew over battle spaces. And while they were involved in the fighting in some way, they weren't really seeing what was happening on the ground. They had coordinates and dropped bombs, things like that. And now they were really seeing what was happening because they had their eyes, the cameras on the battle space the whole time, and could also see what their bombs or their missiles, if they fired some, did on the ground. So that is really a new experience of warfare that we haven't seen. So that's the kind of element that is being discussed somewhat, or actually quite a lot in the media. But there are other soldiers that also see war quite differently because of drones. And these are the army soldiers that are still on the battlefield, but that have now drones with them. And what this does is that they have a much better battle space awareness that they had ever before, and this is at much lower levels, so kind of lower hierarchical levels. Infantry soldiers that used to be the foot soldiers that didn't really know what was going on in a way, now have access to operational level intelligence.
All my infantry mates are still the same, but I understand what you mean.
Yeah, I mean now you have infantry. Now you have infantry soldiers that have access to intelligence through a rover terminal, so they can see what the drone overhead sees, or they have their own kind of personal drone almost, and can watch over the next hill, can see over the next compound wall. And that really is quite a new change, and it also is another step in the direction that soldiers need to be trained much better in kind of technology or in operating a drone. Yeah. So that was another impact on individual soldiers' experience on warfare that I believe has been changed by drones entering the battle space.
It's all fascinating how the ramifications of this technology goes right from what can be a US presidential executive order right down to someone who joined the service on a relatively non-technological aptitude score than having access to the state-of-the-art technology to drive down the road and make sure they don't get in a traffic jam. So this kind of technology is pretty cool. But I also know that you feel that the debate on armed UAVs has let similar, smaller surveillance drones be overlooked. Can you tell listeners a little bit about this area?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is really one of the points that I wanted to bring across in this show because, and I've touched upon this several times in my answers.
Yeah.
So I feel that because everyone is so fascinated by armed drones,
because they got cool
and
names.
because there's such a exactly, yeah, they have very, cool or kind of horrible names.
Yeah.
But yeah, Predator, Reaper, all of that. While the smaller systems have names such as Desert Hawk or Black Hornet. That doesn't sound as cool.
No,
I agree. But yeah, for maybe that reason or for other reasons, most people, when they think drones, they think armed drones. I mean, Predator really has become a synonym of drones.
Yeah.
And this is an important bit of drone warfare. I agree. But the problem is that the use of armed drones, and specifically the use of armed drones for targeted killings, is a tiny aspect of overall drone use. So there are around 90 countries around the world that operate some kind of military drone, but only about a dozen have armed drones, and most of them actually kind of got them last year or the year before that. So most countries really don't have armed drones and don't operate them.
Okay.
And we still kind of don't look at how these smaller systems are being used because they're not so fancy, because they're not so much in the media. So the point I want to bring across is that in most military operations, it's the smaller surveillance system and the ISTAR capability, so this capability of knowing what's going on around you at much lower hierarchical levels, that has really made the biggest difference. And I think that, if someone wants to claim that drones are revolutionary, I would say that that has actually given the biggest change, or that has caused the biggest change. This is battle space awareness. It's not really lifting the fog of war completely, but it certainly has changed the situation on the battlefield quite a lot. So yeah, to all listeners out there, if you think drones, don't just think of armed drones that fly around killing people. There's a lot more out there, and that may actually turn out to be more decisive.
Yeah, give you a friendly Scan Eagle or Skylark a bit of a thought every now and then. They may not pack a punch, but they still do the job. Now, you're my first Prussian descendant on the show that I know of.
Ooh.
I get to ask you the final question, which all guests get asked, but it's a question that was started by the dead Prussian himself, Big Carl. And it relates to our mission on the show, which is to define war in as many ways as possible so that we can continue to explore it and understand the topics that are very, very important and have an impact on many people's lives. I ask each guest to finish a sentence on the show, and that sentence is, war is. I ask you to finish the sentence, war is.
Yeah, thanks a lot. So, I knew that this was coming, obviously, and I thought a lot about this. And I thought I shaped my answer in relation to what we talked about today. So I would say that war is and remains defined by the fog of war. And nothing can completely lift it, certainly no technology. Because war is a fundamentally social affair, and it remains so even if your troops may be further and further away from the battlefield. That would be my effort to make Big Carl proud.
I'm sure he's proud that people are trying to burst through the fog of war, but probably even more proud that one of his Prussian descendants is acknowledging that the fog of war is something you can't remove if you have humans in the mix. That's a great definition of war, and it's a new one, which is good. I always get a little bit bored when our guests just roll out something someone else has rolled out. So you don't get a retest, you get a high distinction on that. Now, Ulrike, thanks very much for coming on the show. It's been a fascinating discussion, not just because I'm a sci-fi geek, or that I think it's really cool that I can go to my local electronics store and buy a drone, although my wife won't let me. But it's interesting to talk about this and how technology is impacting the lives of soldiers. So thank you very much for coming on the show.
Thank you.
Now, listeners, you can follow Ulrike on Twitter at Rike Franke, which is RikeFranke. That's for all the Anglophones out there who don't generally take time to pay attention to pronunciation or any other language. We've got to get better at it, guys. Now, thank you very much for looking at our merchandise, ladies and gents. It's great to see you browsing it. It would be better to see you buy it. You'll notice that we've now released Dead Prussian underwear that is available for purchase because of Reese Crawley. He requested it. He didn't purchase any, so Reese, if you're listening to this, buy my underwear. Also, this week should be the launch of the new show that I'm co-hosting with my mate Rich. It's called War for Idiots. And if you don't like my jokes, tune into that show because Rich is much funnier than I am. And we go through and we chat about some of these topics as only a couple of idiots can. But until next time, listeners, grab a book and crack on.
Join the conversation with us on Twitter at Dead Prussian Pod, on Facebook at the Dead Prussian page, or on our website www.thedeadprussian.com. All show notes for this episode, as well as copyright information, can be found on the website. The Dead Prussian podcast is written, produced and hosted by Mick Cook. It is co-produced by Amanda Levito. The music used throughout is Caught in the Beat by Broke for Free and is used under a Creative Commons Attribution license. All opinions expressed by individuals on the podcast are those of the individual and not necessarily representative of any other organisation.